The night before the signing of the transfer of the late Queen's personal estate at Windsor Castle, an urgent order was issued from the Office of the Judicial Succession. All access codes to the secret royal warehouses at Sandringham Estate were immediately deactivated for all members of the Parker Bowles family. As soon as the list of inherited assets was sealed, Queen Camilla immediately requested an internal inventory of the Queen's personal memorabilia. But what she received in return was a cold refusal from the monarch's most seasoned butlers. The reason? A black leather briefcase containing confidential civil file number 1917C had been activated 48 hours earlier. What's in the file? It contains an honor access order, a terrifying legal title, because it has the potential to strip a branch of a family of all access to its history. Camilla's initial reaction was a frozen silence. She realized that what she was about to lose wasn't the expensive jewelry, but the entire leverage of moral power she had spent 30 years building for her stepchildren. This story will explain why a seemingly harmless private decree could completely alter the course of the monarchy and turn a family ceremony into one of the most spectacular symbolic purges in modern royal history. What followed was a real shock to the blended family structure. King Charles III legally received Balmoral and Sandringham, valued at £550 million, but Secret Order 1917C separated the entire collection of royal carriages and the legendary fell pony from the king and queen. This document specifically names Lady Louise Windsor, the 21-year-old, 17th in line to the throne, and working part-time at a plant nursery, is the supreme and sole owner. This decision officially erects a legal wall, completely excluding Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes from the core heritage axis right at the beginning of the new reign. The true architecture of this inheritance setup cannot be understood by looking at Lady Louise alone. To see why this private document feels like a surgical strike against the new Queen's camp, you have to look directly at Louise's mother, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. Long before her death, Queen Elizabeth II quietly designated Sophie as her favorite daughter-in-law, her secret weapon. While the global media was permanently blinded by the explosive psychodramas of Princess Diana, Sarah Ferguson, and later Meghan Markle, Sophie was executing a completely different strategy. She chose radical, unglamorous proximity to the monarch. She lived just a short drive from Windsor Castle at Bagshot Park. She was the one woman permitted to sit in the back of the late Queen's private vehicle on Sunday mornings, sharing a quiet blanket over their knees. By doting on Louise and ensuring her daughter inherited the most intimate, personal symbols of the House of Windsor, Sophie didn't just secure a pair of ponies for her teenager. She successfully executed a 20-year plan to anchor her biological bloodline into the permanent, moral bedrock of the monarchy, ensuring they remained completely untouchable by whoever sat on the throne next. This is where the historical friction turns razor sharp. The smooth, unified front that Queen Camilla and the Duchess of Edinburgh present to the public today is a masterpiece of palace public relations. But the institutional memory of the court never forgets. To understand the underlying tension, we must go back to the year 2001. Sophie, then the Countess of Wessex, was caught in an undercover sting operation by a reporter disguised as a fake sheikh. In those leaked tapes, Sophie made a series of extraordinarily candid, highly critical remarks about senior royals. Among her sharpest targets, the deeply controversial relationship between the then Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. Though Sophie deeply repented, stepped down from her public relations firm, and spent the next 2 decades in absolute, flawless service to the state to earn her way back into the late Queen's good graces, the ideological divide remained. Camilla's ascension was driven by Charles's personal, unwavering love. Sophie's position was earned through pure institutional loyalty to Elizabeth II. When the late Queen drew up her private will, she was not just handing out mementos. She was validating the woman who had stayed by her side, guaranteeing that Sophie's child would hold the physical evidence of ultimate royal favor long after Camilla achieved her dream of becoming queen. This leaves a massive, unanswered question simmering behind palace doors. If Queen Elizabeth II used her final private testaments to elevate Sophie's lineage to the status of ultimate cultural guardians, what does this mean for the day-to-day stability of the current court? Every time Queen Camilla looks out into the private grounds of Windsor or Balmoral and sees Lady Louise driving the late Prince Philip's signature carriage, she is looking at a physical reminder of a time when her own presence was considered a threat to the stability of the crown. The late queen gave Camilla the title of queen consort, a public necessity for a smooth succession. But she gave Louise the private soul of the family. As King Charles continues to navigate his highly public health challenges, the power dynamics inside the family are quietly shifting. The question is no longer just about who owns the carriage, it is about who holds the true moral authority when the current reign inevitably draws to a close. The tactical genius behind this private inheritance becomes undeniable when you look at the constitutional crisis unfolding silently in the background. A deep structural analysis of the royal family's current trajectory reveals that Thun Vung William is preparing a radical, sweeping overhaul of the royal household for his future reign. The public knows this strategy as the slimmed-down monarchy, a lean, highly efficient corporate model championed by King Charles III. But what looked good on paper a few years ago has mutated into a severe institutional emergency. The court is structurally drying up. With Prince Harry permanently self-exiled in California, Meghan Markle disconnected from royal duties, Prince Andrew permanently deposed due to institutional scandals, and Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie operating strictly as private citizens, the operational burden of the British crown has collapsed onto just two people: William and Kate. As they manage their own grueling schedules and family priorities, they are staring at an empty bench. The monarchy cannot survive on a two-person vanguard. It needs a reliable, flawless strategic reserve. And that is exactly what Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were building when they quietly spent 2 decades grooming Lady Louise Windsor. The brilliance of Louise's positioning lies in her absolute lack of a target. When she turned 18, she held the absolute legal right under the 1,917 letters patent to claim the style and title of Her Royal Highness, Princess Louise of Wessex. The media stood ready for a grand announcement, an induction into the frontline royal apparatus. She chose to say no. She remained Lady Louise Windsor. She packed her bags and went to the University of St. Andrews, quietly enrolling in English literature, walking the exact same historic cobblestones where William met Kate 25 years ago. During her summer breaks, she didn't charter superyachts or frequent high society galas. She took a job at a local garden center, working for minimum wage, interacting with the public without a phalanx of visible security. This was not an accident of humility, it was a masterclass in survival. By refusing the formal HRH title, Louise successfully sidestepped the crushing, toxic weight of the British tabloid press that dismantled Harry and Meghan. She built an armor of total relatability. The press cannot crucify a young woman for being entitled when she spends her June afternoons loading bags of soil into the trunks of suburban cars. Yet, beneath this normal exterior, sits a deeply disciplined royal operator. She joined the University Officer Training Corps, anchoring herself to the military traditions of the state. She took up competitive carriage driving under her direct ancestral family name, Mountbatten Windsor. She became the ultimate paradox, a completely private citizen who possesses the flawless lineage, the unblemished reputation, and the elite training required to step into the center of the state apparatus at a moment's notice. This brings the psychological pressure back onto Queen Camilla's biological circle. Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, have had to walk a razor-thin tightrope for decades. They are private citizens who must constantly manage their public visibility to avoid appearing as though they are leeching off the state. They have had to work exceptionally hard for their independent careers. Yet, despite their absolute discretion and flawless behavior, they can never be part of the state's reserve plan. They cannot step into a military role. They cannot represent the sovereign at a state function. They can never be called upon by William to help stabilize the crown. The late Queen's private will lay this reality completely bare. By placing her most distinct, historically potent personal symbols into the hands of a young woman who deliberately rejected the public title of princess, the late monarch told the world that true royal authority does not come from a public PR campaign or a front-row seat at the coronation. It comes from an unspoken, internal dedication to the preservation of the bloodline. Louise didn't need the title to be chosen. Her grandparents chose her because she understood that in the modern era, the most powerful weapon a royal can possess is total invisibility until the exact moment the institution needs you to step into the light. This leaves Thun Vung William holding an incredibly potent card for his future court. As King Charles III continues his reign amid complex health challenges, The planning for the next transition is accelerating behind the scenes. The palace operators are quietly mapping out what the first 5 years of a King William V era will look like. The central question remains, will William formally call upon his cousin, Lady Louise, to step out of her private life and officially take up the burden of the crown? If he does, the entire visual landscape of the royal court changes instantly. It will solidify the Edinburgh line as the ultimate co-pilots of the Windsor dynasty, leaving the modern, blended family of Queen Camilla completely on the periphery of history. The fuse has been lit by a private document. The explosion will happen when William finally decides to play his hand. In the highly ritualized universe of the British monarchy, there is no piece of theater more definitive than the balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace during Trooping the Colour. It is the ultimate visual summary of power. To the untrained eye, it is a celebratory wave to a cheering crowd. To the institutional core of the palace, it is a cold, living pie chart of legitimacy. For years, King Charles III had driven a hard line on who was permitted to stand on that historic stone platform. The rule was absolute, publicized, and non-negotiable. Only working royals. This rule was the primary mechanism used to publicly justify the exclusion of Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and Prince Andrew. It was the shield Charles used to present his modern, ultra-streamlined monarchy to a tax-paying public. But during recent Trooping the Colour ceremonies, that absolute rule was quietly, deliberately fractured. Standing alongside Thunvung, William, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and their 3 children was a single, striking figure who defied the entire institutional logic of the current reign, Lady Louise Windsor. Louise was not a working royal. She held no official patronages under the sovereign grant. She did not use her HRH princess title. Yet, there she stood, positioned in the prime visual real estate right next to the direct line of succession. At that exact moment, the carefully crafted public relations narrative of a streamlined court dissolved, exposing a profound, hidden hierarchy. The public wasn't looking at an administrative breakdown. They were looking at the physical execution of Queen Elizabeth II's long-term legacy plan. The visual payload of that balcony alignment sent shockwaves through the various factions of the court. For Queen Camilla's biological family, who watched the broadcast from private quarters, the contrast was devastatingly sharp. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes have always accepted their constitutional boundaries with total grace. They have never lobbied for titles, they have never demanded state security, but at major national events, they are placed exactly where the Constitution dictates, in the spectator stands or the lower-tier VIP seating. They are treated as esteemed family guests of the king, but they are entirely segregated from the visual machinery of the state. Louise's presence on that balcony completely rewrote the rules of engagement. By allowing a 21-year-old student who works at garden centers and drives vintage carriages to occupy the same physical space as the future king and queen, the institution signaled that bloodline and legacy possess a unique currency that completely overrides current administrative definitions. Louise didn't need to do the grueling, everyday paperwork of a working royal to earn her spot on that platform. Her very biology, backed by the supreme validation of the late queen's private will, granted her a permanent passport to the core of the state's visual identity. The messaging was impossible to ignore. Governments change, administrative policies on slimmed down courts come and go. But the core genetic and spiritual lineage of the House of Windsor is immutable. This balcony appearance was not an isolated event. It was the continuation of a pattern established during the darkest days of the Vung trio. To find the source of this unspoken elevation, we must look back to the emotional apex of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral proceedings, the Vigil of the Princes. Inside the solemn, echoing expanse of Westminster Hall, the late Queen's 8 grandchildren stood in absolute silence around her coffin. The world's media focused heavily on the visual reconciliation between William and Harry, who stood at the head and foot of the catafalque in their military uniforms. But the real institutional story was unfolding on the flanks. Lady Louise Windsor, then just 18 years old, stood with a calm, arresting dignity that stunned veteran royal commentators. She didn't have the military accolades of her older cousins, nor did she have the decades of public exposure. Yet, she moved with an innate, inherited understanding of the gravity of the moment. She wore her mourning attire not as a relative attending a family funeral, but as a young custodian of the state performing a sacred, dynastic duty. It was during those grueling, silent minutes under the gaze of millions that the public perception of Louise permanently shifted. She was no longer just the quiet daughter of Edward and Sophie. She was recognized as an essential pillar of the family's continuity. This visual elevation leaves a massive, unresolved contradiction at the heart of King Charles's current court. If the policy of a slimmed-down monarchy is supposed to represent efficiency and modernity, why is the institution consistently relying on the visual power of a non-working royal from the old bloodline to project stability? The tension between the modern, blended family of the king and the permanent genetic lineage of the late queen is no longer confined to private legal documents or whispered conversations in the corridors of Windsor. It is being played out in real time, on the most heavily scrutinized balconies and platforms in the world. As the public prepares for the eventual transition to the era of King William V, the true center of the monarchy's visual gravity is becoming crystal clear. The question is no longer whether Lady Louise will have a role in the future of the family. The question is how the current Queen's camp will adapt to a future where they are completely eclipsed by a young woman who holds the ultimate blessing of the past. The complex reality of a modern, blended court becomes starkly apparent when you analyze the public statements made by Queen Camilla's children against the cold reality of palace hierarchy. Tom Parker Bowles has been remarkably consistent and refreshingly blunt in his public appearances. He has stated directly to the media, "We are married in. We are not the royal family." On the surface, this is the perfect public relations response. It projects humility, sets realistic expectations for the British public, and protects the king from accusations of nepotism. But inside the psychological echo chamber of the palace, that public disavowal carries a sharp, underlying sting. There is an immense, unbridgeable chasm between being loved by a king and being legitimized by the crown. King Charles III has shown immense warmth to Tom and Laura, ensuring they are integrated into private family milestones and casual gatherings. Their children call him Upa, and the domestic bond is undeniably real. Yet, when the private assets of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were distributed, that warmth did not translate into a single piece of historically significant family property. The complete absence of Camilla's biological descendants from the private wills was not an administrative oversight, it was a structural statement. It served as a permanent, legally binding reminder that while a blended family can share a holiday dinner, they cannot share a dynasty. The late Queen's private assets, the relics that defined her personal peace and Philip's life's passion, were reserved exclusively for those who carry the direct genetic blueprint of the House of Windsor. For a family that has spent decades navigating public scrutiny to achieve a position of high social standing, being completely excluded from the family's inner heirloom collection represents a profound, quiet marginalization. This emotional friction is compounded by the brutal, physical geography of the royal estates. The public often views places like Balmoral and Sandringham as singular, massive holiday homes. In reality, they are sprawling, fragmented ecosystems consisting of multiple private lodges, specific hunting grounds, and intensely personal trails. Under the current reign of King Charles III, Queen Camilla's children and grandchildren enjoy unprecedented hospitality on these grounds during the summer recess. They ride horses, fish the rivers, and walk the private paths. But their access to this geography is entirely conditional. It is a temporary lease granted solely by the personal favor of the reigning king. The moment the crown transitions to the generation of Thun Vung William, that lease instantly expires. Tom, Laura, and their children hold no ancestral right to the territory. They will return to being entirely private citizens, completely detached from the sovereign soil. Lady Louise Windsor, however, holds a permanent, unassailable anchor within that exact same geography. Because she inherited the late Prince Philip's custom-built carriage, his prized fell ponies, and a substantial portion of the late Queen's personal equestrian equipment, her physical footprint on the private estates is legally protected by civilian property law. She does not occupy Balmoral as a guest of the current king. She occupies it as the designated custodian of its most sacred traditions. This creates an intense, unspoken dynamic during the family's joint retreats. While Camilla's family enjoys the superficial luxury of the main castle, they do so knowing they are temporary visitors. Meanwhile, Louise moves through the estate with the absolute confidence of a young woman who knows that her presence is woven into the very fabric of the monarchy's permanent history. The sharp distinction between these two camps was illustrated perfectly during the private memorial events held for the late Prince Philip. While senior members of the royal family arrived in formal state vehicles, surrounded by security details and intense press coverage, Lady Louise arrived driving her grandfather's signature dark green carriage through the private grounds of Windsor Castle. On the carriage seat sat the empty cap, the leather driving gloves, and the red pot of sugar, lumps the exact items Philip used to reward his ponies. It was an extraordinarily moving, highly visual act of commemoration that completely overshadowed the formal, administrative tributes paid by the rest of the family. Louise didn't need a public relations team to craft her homage. She simply stepped into the role her grandfather had prepared for her. For Camilla's biological family, watching from the periphery, that moment crystallized the true nature of their isolation. They can attend the grand state dinners, they can wear the finest designer clothing, and they can stand on the edges of royal photographs. But they can never replicate the effortless, inherited authenticity of a direct descendant who has been handed the physical keys to the dynasty's emotional heart. This profound structural separation leaves the current court operating under a highly fragile, temporary peace. As King Charles III continues to navigate his reign with Queen Camilla by his side, the palace operators must work overtime to ensure that the internal friction between the bloodline and the stepfamily never spills over into the public domain. But the clock is ticking. Every day brings the institution closer to the inevitable era of King William V, a transition that will permanently dismantle the current, inclusive, blended family model. When Charles is no longer on the throne to protect the social standing of the Bowles-Lopes line, how will the family dynamics shift when William formally assumes control of the estates? Will the transition be a smooth, quiet exit for Camilla's camp, or will the hidden tensions that have been simmering since the unsealing of the late Queen's private duchess finally break through the palace's walls? The ultimate answer lies in the hands of the young woman who is quietly practicing her carriage driving on the private trails of Windsor, waiting for her time to serve the crown. We return to the exact question that has driven this investigation from the very beginning. Why did Queen Elizabeth II choose to completely bypass Queen Camilla's family for her private treasures? And what does this decision mean for the future of the British monarchy? The answer is not found in an administrative oversight, a petty family dispute, or a sudden burst of grandmotherly sentimentality. It is found in a cold, brilliant, and deeply calculated act of constitutional preservation. When the late Queen drew up the final amendments to her private will, she was staring directly at a changing world. She knew her son, Charles, would ascend the throne as an elderly monarch. She knew his reign would be a transitional era, defined by a modern, blended family structure that would naturally invite non-bloodline relatives into the private inner sanctum of the court. She recognized that while a modern court must project inclusion to survive, an ancient dynasty must preserve its core genetic and spiritual identity to remain legitimate. By deliberately diverting her most sentimentally potent, intensely personal equestrian relics away from the reigning king and his consort, and placing them unreservedly into the hands of Lady Louise Windsor, the late monarch executed a brilliant chess move. She gave Camilla the public crown, satisfying the immediate political needs of the state. But she gave Louise the permanent soul of the family, ensuring that the true moral identity of the House of Windsor remained firmly anchored to the biological bloodline. This strategic distribution of wealth serves an even greater purpose as the institution accelerates toward the inevitable transition of power. The slimmed-down monarchy of the current reign is no longer just a policy. It is a structural vulnerability. As the operational burden of the state threatens to overwhelm the few remaining working royals, the true value of Lady Louise Windsor's quiet preparation has become undeniable. Louise did not choose invisibility out of fear, she chose it out of tactical necessity. Her long-game strategy reached its most significant milestone when she officially graduated from the University of St. Andrews with an undergraduate Master of Arts in English and International Relations. Immediately following her graduation, she was presented with the ultimate honor, the Duke of Edinburgh's Gold Award, handed to her by her proud father, Prince Edward, at the Palace of Holyrood House. Instead of jumping into a commercial corporate role or demanding a taxpayer-funded royal stipend, she has chosen to take a disciplined gap year to work, volunteer, and travel. She remains entirely unblemished by the toxic tabloid wars that dismantled the Sussexes. When Thun Vung William eventually takes the throne, he will be forced to look to his cousins to rebuild the operational capacity of the court. Because of his grandparents' foresight, he will find a young woman who has been explicitly trusted, legally validated, and quietly groomed by both Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Louise will not step into the light as an outsider. She will step forward as the designated custodian of the family's deepest traditions. This is the final, undeniable resolution of the late Queen's private testament. The tension that continues to simmer behind palace doors is not about the material value of carriages, ponies, or equestrian equipment. It is about the permanent, unforgiving boundary line that those items represent. For Queen Camilla's biological descendants, the reality is now set in stone. They are deeply loved by Charles, they are honored guests at family gatherings, and they are welcome to enjoy the hospitality of the royal estates during the current reign. But they are entirely temporary fixtures in the history of the realm. The moment Charles's time on the throne draws to a close, their passport to the inner sanctum instantly expires. They will return to their private, independent lives, completely separated from the machinery of the British state. Louise, however, stands on the sovereign soil by absolute right of direct ancestral inheritance. She does not need a temporary invitation to exist within the history of the family. Her presence is permanent, her lineage is validated, and her future is structurally secured. Ultimately, the unsealing of that private legal document changed everything. It reminded the world that in the high-stakes survival game of the British monarchy, true power is never just about who wears the crown today, it is about who is trusted to protect the spirit of the Vung trio tomorrow. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip saw the future of their family, and they chose to invest its most sacred tokens of legitimacy into a quiet, disciplined young woman who chose education, military training, and duty over fleeting fame. Lady Louise Windsor inherited legitimacy. Queen Camilla's camp did not. And as the current trio d'are navigates its complex challenges and prepares for the inevitable transition to the generation of Thun Vung William, that private decision will continue to stand as a silent, insurmountable monument to the enduring power of the Windsor bloodline. So, as we watch Louise continue to drive her grandfather's carriage through the private trails of Windsor, the true meaning of her inheritance becomes absolutely undeniable. She is not just a relative on the periphery. She is the quiet princess who was chosen from the very beginning to carry the true weight of the legacy forward.